Thank you, Sam. You seem pretty comfortable behind the pulpit. I don't think that's your first rodeo. Our gospel reading with our Easter story is found in Matthew chapter 28, beginning with verse number 1. After the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. And suddenly there was a great earthquake, for an angel of the Lord descending from heaven came and rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning and his clothing white as snow. For fear of him, the guards shook and became like dead men. But the angel said to the women, "Do not be afraid. I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has been raised, as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples he has been raised from the dead, and indeed he is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. This is my message for you." So they left the tomb quickly with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them and said, "Greetings." And they came to him, took hold of his feet, and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me." May God bless the reading and the hearing of this word, and may we hear in it a word that is to us and that is for us on this day. Although our family lives very much in the city, our house is surrounded by a wooded area, enough so that we have our own sort of ecosystem. We on occasion have deer in our backyard. We have raccoons. We once saw a white raccoon and were informed that this makes it a city raccoon. We have moles and rabbits, and we have squirrels, but everybody has squirrels. We have an owl that's taken residence in a tree next to the house on occasion, and a hawk in our neighborhood. When the hawk and the moles and the rabbits meet, it doesn't typically end very well for the moles and the rabbits. There's also another form of life, cicadas, around the woods in our house. You probably know their story. They are a bug, a locust kind of bug, I think, who live underground for anywhere from 13 to 17 years. We find their little brown shells on trees, on the ground. Sometimes they make their way into our carport. On the surface, those shells, they're not very attractive. They have these large, empty eye sockets and 6 claws. Their appearance serves as evidence that God might, in fact, have a sense of humor. Despite the surface appearance, however, it's hard not to find some beauty in them because they are evidence that something like a miracle has occurred. They look dead, but they aren't dead at all. They're just empty shells. Each one of those shells has a slit down the back from which the living cicadas have escaped, while pulling their new legs and their new eyes, and most importantly, their new wings out of that shell and taking flight. Only occasionally do we see a living cicada. The great evidence of their presence in our lives, though, is the song they sing. Mostly at night and mostly around dusk. Sometimes their song just sort of blends in, forms a kind of comforting, soothing white noise. And then other times it is so loud that you have to stop and take notice and admire their volume and their enthusiasm. I like to imagine that when they get really loud, it is simply a product of their joy. After a decade and a half there in the ground, to be out amongst the mystery and the wonder of it all. And so they sing. Like the empty shell of the cicada, sometimes when it comes to Easter and the resurrection, I fear that our attention is drawn too tightly to the empty tomb. What exactly happened in there? Well, the gospel writers, even they can't fully agree upon that. What was the mindset of the first believers? Where were they in their thinking about what had happened? But most importantly, I suppose, what are we supposed to believe about it? Because goodness knows there's no shortage of voices who would suggest that we better believe the right thing about it or else. As for me, it is the song of those cicadas, sung at dusk, which tells me the most that I know about them. And it is the songs that we sing about Easter, which tells me most about what resurrection means. It is a song of life which overcomes death. It is a song of light which shines in the darkness and will not be extinguished. It is a song of compassion which overcomes the vitriol of the world. It is a song of love which endures for all of eternity. And it is a song which the church can and should sing from its very diaphragm. As Matthew tells it, it was Mary Magdalene and the other Mary who went to the tomb toward dawn on that Sunday. Now, if you into the details, Matthew also suggested that there was an earthquake, and the rest of the gospel writers leave that out. There was an angel, apparently with a gym membership, muscled up and moved that stone out of the way. There were some guards at the tomb who hadn't signed up for this angel with the big biceps and all that was happening. They found themselves petrified. Of all the details, the one, though, that I find the most interesting is what we might call the first verb of the resurrection. It was the first thing that any one of the followers were asked to do about it. Or perhaps we could just call it resurrection's first song. First the angel, and then the resurrected Jesus instructed them to go and tell the disciples. Now, perhaps you remember the final days and hours of Jesus and that his relationships with those disciples fractured. It took a tragic, tragic turn. They had spent those hours, the disciples, in a petty argument about who was the greatest. And then after making bold pledges about their faithfulness to Jesus, they gave in to fear when the rubber of it all met the road of it all. They were nowhere to be found when Jesus needed them the most, and now they were living in the reality that this was the last chapter of their life. And it was a tragic ending. And then the angel said, "Go and tell the disciples what you have seen." But Jesus picks it up in a more intimate fashion to send an important message. Go and tell my brothers, my family. So lean into this with me. The first act of the first struggling believers was an act of reconciliation. It was an announcement of forgiveness. It was the tearing down of a wall that might have stood between Jesus and his friends forever. I wonder if that might provide some clues as to what believers and struggling believers are meant to be up to these days. Perhaps this is a hint of the song that we should be singing. It seems to me that Christianity, which has as its core story, this story, comes to us in two fundamental forms. On the one hand, there is a creedal form of Christianity. A faith intent on establishing the boundaries. The appeal to this for some is that it operates in black and white. There's little ambiguity for the believer to be concerned about. It establishes what one needs to believe about God, what one needs to believe about Jesus, what one needs to believe about eternity, and among other things, what one needs to believe about this story if one wishes to stand on the inside of the belief system. When channel surfing, which I do occasionally, I come across a show titled Ask the Pastor. Ask the Pastor has a panel of pastors, each sitting at a table with a Bible in front of them. I have a secret bucket list wish that I'll let you in on. I hope to be invited to be on Ask the Pastor. I feel reasonably certain that my first appearance would be my last. Still, I want my crack at it. People call into the show and they ask all sorts of questions, and never once have the pastors on the panel failed to come up with an answer to what are some often very random theological queries. I'll not call them unimportant because they obviously are important to the people calling in. But what is impressed upon me, though, is the anxiety I hear in their questions. Now, there's something admirable about wanting to get things right, but there seems a sad fear at play, as callers seem afraid of the prospect of getting anything wrong. There is a place on the inside, they are certain, for those who get the answers right, and a place on the outside for those who get the answers wrong. But there is another way. And the light of Easter shines upon it. I believe we find one of the seminal moments of this way played out in this story. I want to reread a paragraph of this sermon. And I hope that isn't haughty to believe that anything I have to say is so important that you need to hear it twice. It's as if I'm quoting myself, and that doesn't feel right. But nevertheless, let me read it again for emphasis. The first act of the first struggling believers was an act of reconciliation. It was an announcement of a grand form of forgiveness. It was a tearing down of a wall which might have stood between Jesus and his followers forever. This way of this resurrection faith isn't concerned about setting up the boundaries and the parameters which establish who is in and who is out. In fact, its aims are quite the opposite. Its energy and its actions are aimed at tearing down the walls, which define one person as an insider and another as an outsider. Its energy and its actions are aimed at tearing down the walls which create hostility and enmity between you and I. Catholic theologian Hans Küng got to the heart of the scandal of Jesus, which was the thing that stirred up all of this stuff on Holy Week. This was the real scandal, he wrote. Did Jesus really have to go so far? What kind of naive love is this, he asked. What kind of dangerous and naive love is this, which does not know the limits, the frontiers between fellow countrymen and foreigners, between party members and non-members, between neighbors and distant people? What kind of naive love is this? It is the love of Jesus. These are the verbs which identified the first struggling believers in the resurrection. Not a demarcation which established boundaries to determine insiders and outsiders, but instead active forms of reconciliation which blurred those boundaries until they just disappeared. Not a building of unholy walls, but instead a breaking down of walls until that glorious day that they are nothing but dust and rubble. If this was their song, if the first believers, as they struggled to understand, left quickly from the tomb to reconcile and to forgive and to tear down walls, then perhaps the church, which bears the scandalous name of Jesus, is invited to sing along with them. To sing not just with our voices, but to sing from our collective diaphragm. And maybe, just maybe, if like the cicadas we sing loudly and we sing clearly enough, then the rest of the world will join in until those walls, every last one of them, crumble to the ground. That is a vision just grand enough to believe in.